There's a common assumption in modern culture that if someone isn't highly visible, they must be insecure. If they're not sharing their face, their lifestyle, their achievements, or their appearance, people assume something is lacking. But that belief says more about the culture than it does about the individual being judged. For many empaths, choosing not to self-display isn't a sign of low confidence. It's often the opposite. It can reflect a mindset that has outgrown the need for constant external validation. This is where psychology becomes intriguing. Many people have been conditioned to equate attention with value. Over time, visibility became intertwined with identity. The more you're seen, the more important you seem. The more approval you receive, the more secure you appear. Social media, by its very nature, reinforces this idea. It turns validation into something measurable. Likes act as social evidence. Comments serve as emotional rewards. Views become a skewed version of status. Empaths, however, tend to experience this dynamic differently. They are often highly attuned to emotional subtleties. They don't just observe the surface interaction, someone posting content and others responding. They sense the underlying exchange, the desire for validation, the performance behind self-presentation, the silent negotiation that says, notice me, approve of me, reassure me that I matter. For a deeply self-aware empath, this can feel draining. Not because they think sharing is wrong, but because they resist tying their identity to public reaction. That distinction matters. An empath who avoids posting photos may not be rejecting connection, they may be rejecting dependence. There is a meaningful difference between wanting to be seen and needing to feel validated. Many empaths, after years of being emotionally attuned to others, begin to value something rare, a sense of self untouched by outside opinion. Mans consider how unusual that is. In a performance-driven culture, most people are taught to construct an image. Empaths often feel driven to preserve authenticity because they recognize something others overlook. When identity becomes entangled with public approval, it becomes easier to lose yourself. Once your sense of worth relies on external response, you risk emotional outsourcing. Your confidence fluctuates based on attention. Your peace becomes conditional. Your self-image becomes partly shaped by strangers. Mature empaths in particular tend to recognize this risk. They prefer being grounded over being admired. They choose authenticity over impressiveness. Sometimes they even choose being unknown over being misunderstood. Being this perspective often reflects a deeper philosophical outlook. Empaths tend to prioritize essence over appearance, depth over display, and meaning over spectacle. When someone values inner alignment more than external recognition, self-promotion can start to feel irrelevant. If you already know who you are, what is there left to prove? That question can be unsettling because much of modern behavior revolves around proving attractiveness, success, happiness, and relevance. Empaths, however, often step away from systems that demand constant proof, not out of arrogance, but out of freedom. They stop performing identity and begin fully living it, and that shift changes everything. You'll often notice that emotionally intelligent individuals become more private over time. That's not withdrawal, it's refinement. They come to understand that not everything needs to be shared. Not every moment requires an audience. Not every aspect of the self belongs in public view. And perhaps most importantly, not all value grows when exposed. Some things deepen in private, peace grows in privacy, self-trust strengthens in privacy, clarity sharpens in privacy. Empaths often grasp this instinctively. There's another dimension many overlook. Empaths are frequently sensitive to comparison culture, not because they feel inferior, but because they see how harmful comparison can be. They recognize what happens when identity turns into competition, when life becomes curated instead of lived, when self-worth gets trapped in cycles of measuring, performing, and chasing approval. So many empaths quietly disengage. This isn't passivity, it's psychological independence. It's a refusal to let technology shape self-perception. It's a refusal to turn identity into a commodity. In a world fixated on being seen, there is real power in defining yourself. That power is often misunderstood. Silence is mistaken for insecurity. Privacy is mistaken for weakness. Restraint is mistaken for absence. Yet some of the most self-assured people have little interest in constant visibility because they no longer crave what attention provides. They've found fulfillment elsewhere, in purpose, inner peace, genuine relationships, and self-respect. These are things no algorithm can quantify. In fact, one of the clearest signs of inner stability is the ability to exist without announcing yourself, to understand your worth without displaying it, to hold depth without packaging it, to remain complete without applause. That isn't detachment, it's freedom. For many empaths, choosing not to share their photos is a quiet expression of that freedom, a subtle declaration that identity is not a performance, that worth does not require witnesses, and that presence is not diminished by privacy. And perhaps this is what unsettles others most. When someone no longer seeks validation, they become harder to influence. They aren't driven by approval. They aren't easily pulled into comparison. They aren't tempted by shallow recognition. This kind of psychological sovereignty is rare, yet very real. Many empaths embody it quietly, not because they are hiding, but because they no longer confuse visibility with value. That may be one of the most radical forms of self-possession in today's world. The moment you stop asking others to confirm your worth is the moment you begin to fully own it. And once you recognize that empaths don't avoid visibility due to insecurity, the next question becomes far more compelling. Why do so many of them deliberately safeguard their privacy? Jangin, this is where much of the deeper psychology is often overlooked. For an empath, privacy is rarely about concealment. It is about protection. Highly sensitive individuals tend to experience exposure in ways that differ from others. What feels casual to one person may feel intrusive to an empath. What seems like harmless sharing to most can feel, to a deeply perceptive mind, like opening a door that may not easily be closed. Empaths don't just process information, they process energy. Whether you interpret that in psychological, emotional, or philosophical terms, the pattern remains consistent. They understand that revealing yourself invites interpretation, and interpretation is never neutral. Chimbalayam. The moment something is shared, it no longer belongs solely to you. It becomes part of other people's perceptions, projections, judgments, envy, admiration, resentment, assumptions, and unconscious narratives. While many overlook this, empaths often sense it immediately. This awareness reshapes how they approach self-disclosure. They grasp something subtle yet significant. Not everyone observing you does so with pure intentions. Some look through the lens of comparison, some through envy, others through concealed hostility. Still, some search for weaknesses, and some, perhaps most concerning, seek access. Empaths, especially those who have experienced manipulation, betrayal, or emotional exploitation, become highly attuned to this reality. And awareness inevitably alters behavior. Someone who has learned that visibility can invite intrusion does not treat privacy lightly. They treat it as a boundary. Psychologically, boundaries are among the clearest indicators of emotional well-being. Yet this is often misunderstood. Guardedness is labeled as withdrawal, fear, or avoidance when it may actually reflect discernment. And discernment is not distrust. It is the ability to recognize what deserves access and what does not. That is wisdom, and empaths often develop it through difficult experiences. Many empaths spend years overexposing themselves emotionally. They give too much, reveal too much, trust too easily, and assume others share their sincerity. Eventually, reality challenges that assumption. They encounter gossip, projection, manipulation, people who study their vulnerabilities and use openness as leverage. After enough of these encounters, a shift occurs. The empath stops viewing openness as inherently virtuous and begins to see selectivity as essential. This marks a profound psychological evolution. Immature sensitivity tends to spill outward, mature sensitivity learns to protect itself. And that protection often takes the form of privacy. Sometimes it means not sharing personal images. Sometimes it means keeping meaningful moments off public platform. Sometimes it means refusing to grant strangers easy access to the intimate details of one's life. Not out of fear of being seen, but out of intention about who is allowed to see. There is strength in that, especially in a culture that normalizes exposure. We live in a time where oversharing is often mistaken for authenticity. But authenticity without boundaries is not authenticity. It is vulnerability without discernment. Mature empaths recognize the difference. Samblenda, they understand that not every observer deserves entry into their inner or outer world. Mundine, once privacy becomes an act of self-respect, silence no longer feels empty, it feels sovereign. And there is another dimension that is rarely acknowledged. Empaths are often highly sensitive to emotional residue, the lingering psychological effects of interaction, the fatigue that follows unnecessary exposure, the subtle heaviness that can arise from feeling watched, interpreted, or entangled in too many perceptions. While others may dismiss this, empaths frequently experience it firsthand. From a psychological perspective, there is support for this. Highly sensitive individuals tend to process social stimuli more deeply. They may feel judgment more intensely, dwell longer on criticism, and notice relational tension others barely perceive. What appears to outsiders as overprotectiveness may actually be a reasonable response to heightened processing. In other words, they are not avoiding imagined harm. They are preventing anticipated harm. That is not weakness. It is psychological awareness. Strong individuals often prioritize prevention over reaction. They don't wait to repair repeated damage. They structure their lives to minimize unnecessary harm from the outset. That is the purpose of boundaries. That is the role of privacy. Spleen. This is why many empaths do not equate accessibility with kindness. They do not see openness to everyone as a virtue. They recognize that unrestricted access invites disorder, and disorder tends to drain those who are sensitive. So they become selective, deliberately, quietly, sometimes invisibly. Others may interpret this as distance, but it is often discipline. Because privacy is not always about excluding others, sometimes it is about preserving yourself. That may be the deeper truth. Protecting your peace is not selfish. Limiting unnecessary exposure is not paranoia. Choosing to keep parts of your life sacred is not antisocial, it is self-governance. And psychologically, self-governance is one of the clearest signs of maturity. A person who can decide what to share, what to withhold, who is granted access, and where their emotional boundaries lie is not hiding, they are in control. That person is aware, and awareness often appears unusual to those moving through life unconsciously. This is one reason empaths are so frequently misunderstood. Their restraint is interpreted as insecurity. Their privacy is mistaken for secrecy. Their boundaries are confused with barriers. But barriers isolate while boundaries protect. Understanding that difference can reshape an entire life. Because ultimately every empath faces a defining choice. Will I remain endlessly accessible to prove openness, or will I protect what matters because I recognize its value? That is not a trivial decision. It marks the line between emotional exhaustion and emotional sovereignty. And perhaps the deeper truth is this: what you choose to protect reveals what you consider precious. If an empath safeguards their peace, their image, their inner world, their private life, it may not come from fear of the world, it may come from a clear recognition of their own worth. The moment privacy is no longer seen as hiding, it becomes what it often truly is: an intelligent defense of something blind. Once you see that empaths are not simply avoiding visibility or guarding privacy, a deeper pattern emerges. Many of them are more invested in experiencing life than in performing it. And that distinction may be one of the defining psychological divides of our time. Modern culture has subtly trained people to equate documentation with participation, to believe that if a moment isn't shared, it matters less, that if an experience isn't displayed, it is somehow incomplete, that without witnesses, it loses significance. Empaths tend to resist this idea instinctively because they engage with life through presence, not performance. These are fundamentally different modes of being. Performance asks, how will this look? Presence asks, how fully am I living this? Performance directs moments outward, while presence draws awareness inward. Empaths often feel the tension between these states intensely. The moment an experience is curated for observation, something shifts. Attention divides. Part of the self steps outside the moment to manage perception, to frame it, to anticipate reactions. Many empaths sense this split. They notice how easily living becomes presenting, and they resist it. This tendency often arises from a deeper orientation toward meaning. Empaths typically value lived experience over representation. They care more about what something feels like than how it appears, more about emotional truth than social optics. As a result, performative culture can feel hollow to them. Much of modern life, especially online, revolves around turning experiences into images. Empaths often prefer the experience before it becomes an image. They value the quiet conversation no one else hears, the sunset undisturbed by a camera, the personal victory unshared, the moment that exists fully without becoming content. Man, there is something deeply philosophical in this, because it raises a question many people never stop to consider. When does documenting life begin to interfere with living it? Once identity becomes tied to display, experiences can become tools rather than ends in themselves. Moments stop being lived for their own sake and start being collected for presentation. And in that shift, something essential can be lost: the immediacy of the moment, the intimacy of presence, the depth of undivided attention. Empaths often guard these qualities carefully because they understand, whether consciously or intuitively, that attention shapes experience. Where attention goes, life follows. If attention is constantly redirected towards self-presentation, something deeper can fade: inner stillness, authenticity, direct contact with reality as it is rather than how it appears. This is why many empaths resist the pressure to turn their lives into continuous public performance. Not because they are disconnected from the world, but because they are trying to remain connected to what is real. And being there is also another psychological layer at play. Empaths often feel uneasy with self-objectification, with turning themselves into something to be consumed, evaluated, or arranged for approval. While this has become normalized, empaths tend to notice it more acutely. They recognize when identity starts to become a product, when personhood begins to resemble a brand. And many quietly step away from that dynamic because they do not want to exist as performers in a marketplace of perception. They want to remain fully human. Man, that may sound simple, but in a culture driven by spectacle, choosing not to perform is a subtle form of resistance. Empaths often practice this resistance quietly by not sharing every success, by keeping joy private, by allowing experiences to belong to themselves rather than an audience, and by refusing to equate attention with meaning. This refusal reshapes how life is lived. When the question shifts from how will this be seen to what is this moment asking me to feel, everything changes. It leads to a different kind of life, slower, deeper, less performative, a life where meaning does not depend on being witnessed. Many empaths are drawn to this, even if they cannot fully explain it. They simply recognize that constant performance drains them. It feels artificial, fragmented, and emotionally costly. So they step away from it, quietly and intentionally. Others may misinterpret this as disengagement or detachment. But often the opposite is true. The empath may be more engaged with reality than those documenting it because they are not dividing themselves between experience and projection. They are simply present, and presence, psychologically, is one of the rarest and most powerful human capacities. It sharpens awareness, deepens connection, strengthens intuition, and restores inner calm. Empaths tend to value this over visibility. Jan, this is not avoidance. It is alignment. It is choosing to be rather than to appear. And that may be one of the most meaningful choices a person can make. Because eventually, everyone encounters a question the digital world keeps trying to answer for them. Is life meant to be lived or displayed? Most people never stop long enough to consider it. Empaths often do. And that pause transforms them. It makes them more selective, more grounded within themselves, less captivated by appearances, less willing to trade depth for attention. But in many cases, that is exactly why they feel no urge to constantly share themselves. They are too occupied with living a life, not curating one. And perhaps this is what is worth remembering. Not every meaningful life is meant to be visible. Not every fulfilled person lives in the spotlight. Not every strong presence seeks acknowledgement. Some of the most profound individuals you'll encounter aren't performing at all. They're simply living quietly, fully, and authentically. There is remarkable strength. In a time when nearly everyone is pulled toward performance, the person who stays present becomes quietly revolutionary. The one who refuses to turn every moment into proof becomes free. And the one who values depth of experience over how it might appears may be the one who understands life most clearly. Because what you no longer feel the need to perform may be what you have finally come to truly own. But once you recognize that many empaths don't avoid posting due to insecurity, that they treat privacy as a boundary, and that they often choose presence over performance, another layer begins to surface, one that is frequently misunderstood. What appears to be withdrawal is sometimes self-respect, and this is where the psychology deepens. There are empaths who were once very open, people who shared easily, trusted quickly, expressed themselves often, and made their inner world widely accessible. Then life taught them something, not through theory, but through experience, through betrayal, manipulation, misunderstanding, and the realization that visibility can attract not only appreciation, but projection, not only connection, but exploitation. When that realization settles deeply, something shifts. The empath becomes more selective. From the outside, that selectivity can look like distance, and this is where misinterpretation happens. Others assume the person has become cold, guarded, or detached. But in reality, something more refined has taken place. They have developed standards. And standards, especially those shaped by pain, often form the foundation of self-respect. Unbound, this distinction matters because reduced openness is often mistaken for damage, yet sometimes it signals growth. The person who shares less, reveals less, and exposes less has not necessarily been diminished. They may have become more aware. They have learned a difficult truth. Not everyone who gains access to you deserves it. That realization naturally reshapes behavior. Maturity is not remaining equally open after repeated harm. It is learning to adjust what you allow. Means empaths often make this adjustment in subtle but powerful ways. They stop over-explaining themselves to those determined to misunderstand them. They stop offering emotional transparency to those who misuse vulnerability. They stop making themselves easily readable to people who analyze openness for advantage. And yes, sometimes they stop sharing personal images, not because they fear being seen, but because they understand the cost of casual exposure. There is deep psychological intelligence in this. Self-respect often begins the moment you stop offering yourself in places where you are consistently mishandled. That is not bitterness, it is evolution. Many empaths grow precisely because they have been hurt. When pain is processed, it sharpens awareness. It reveals patterns, exposes false intimacy, and clarifies the difference between attention and genuine care, between curiosity and real concern, between those who celebrate you and those who quietly resent you. These lessons may come late, but once learned, they are not easily forgotten. This is why the quieter empath is so often misunderstood. Less sharing is mistaken for insecurity. Reduced visibility is seen as withdrawal, but in reality, it may reflect someone who no longer confuses access with connection, someone who longer believes openness must be unconditional, someone who now treats their presence as valuable. And valuable things are not distributed carelessly, they are protected. This marks a profound internal shift. Early on, many empaths equate love with unlimited availability, endless understanding, and unrestricted emotional access. Over time, if they grow, they discover a more balanced truth. Love without boundaries invites exploitation. Compassion without discernment leads to exhaustion, and openness without standards invites misuse. Once this becomes clear, the empath changes not in who they are, but in how they operate. Their heart may remain open, but their boundaries become intelligent. That intelligence can look like silence, privacy, reduced exposure, or even intentional invisibility. But none of these necessarily signal fear. They signal mastery. One of the clearest expressions of self-respect is no longer making yourself easy to consume, no longer placing your identity in environments that diminish it, no longer offering intimacy where it cannot be honored. In a world that rewards constant accessibility, this can seem unusual, but it is often deeply healthy. Psychologically, the ability to step away from what diminishes you is strength. The ability to say, not everyone's access to this part of me is strength. Choosing peace over visibility is strength. Refusing to perform openness for those who misuse it is strength. And many empaths reach this strength only after enduring what once tried to break them. That makes it hard-earned, deeply earned. This is why the quiet empath can be more powerful than they appear. What looks like retreat may actually be restraint. What looks like distance may be discipline. What looks like disappearance may be self-possession. And self-possession is rare. It means you belong to yourself again, not to public opinion, not to external projections, not to the expectations of those demanding access to you. That is a profound kind of recovery. It often begins when the question shifts from how can I be more accepted to what actually deserves access to me. That single shift changes everything. When life is organized around what deserves access rather than who demands it, manipulation becomes harder, emotional drain becomes less likely, and identity becomes more stable. This is where real inner strength begins, not in control over others, but in clarity within yourself. Not in withdrawal, but in refusing to be misused. Perhaps that is the deeper truth behind the empath who no longer shares as they once did. You are not seeing someone who has become smaller. You may be seeing someone who has stopped making themselves available to what diminishes them. That is not collapse, it is self-respect taking shape, and often it marks the beginning of genuine freedom. Because the moment you stop viewing reduced access as a loss, you begin to recognize it for what it can be, a quiet boundary where dignity begins. And remember this, those who reveal the least are not always hiding. Sometimes they have simply learned that what is sacred loses its power when it is given to everyone,